Sound, music, sustainability. Welcome to Sustain FM. All right, welcome to today's episode of Sustain FM. I'm your host, Steve Williams, or Drew's Noise, depending on the day. And today on the show, we have Megan Gette. I'm excited to talk to her. Megan's an artist, writer, poet, editor, and quoting from her bio here, is interested in how sense-making is articulated and given material form, examining techniques and technologies of listening through which extractive, atmospheric shape perception in ordinary life. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of interesting things I want to talk about there. So in the academic world, her artistic research and writing engage with sound studies, the environmental humanities, elemental and chemical anthropology, the anthropology of energy and infrastructure, affect and STS. She's also interested in conceptual and experimental ethnographies, poetics, what's eludes definition, fluidity, immaterialisms, and the senses. And I think we could probably do like an hour-long podcast on like almost every single words of that kind of bio. So Megan, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. I'm happy to be here.
Great, most welcome. So to get started, one of the things I'm always interested when I talk to artists that also work with technology is sort of about which came first. And with you in particular, I'm curious because your artistic work both uses and critiques technology. So I'm kind of curious, were you kind of interested in sort of technologies and recording and sound and kind of stuff first and then moved into the artistic world? Or were you more interested in ideas of sound and writing and poetry and that kind of came first and then technology was more of a means to an end, or was it a little bit of both? I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, I think that question's really interesting. There's a way that I could think about it as an either or, where maybe I have been thinking about sound or poetry or writing, and that made itself into a question of technology. I think at the center for me is like what technology is and how it does, rather than as something separate or anthropogenic or somehow electronic and separable from the means to thinking. So for me, like language is a technology, or any means to make or think with materials is a form of technology. Going to ways that this has been conceived in anthropology, but also, just in a kind of thinking about technology more broadly, rather than something that is imminently tied to some electronic form.
So not just the wires and cables, but technology in a broader sense. Okay.
Yeah, and I think I guess wires and cables became interesting to me when I was doing work for my dissertation, which was kind of concerned with these informal communities of people who were doing environmental monitoring in some form or aspect, and how those inflected with a kind of institutional technologies or engineering projects that were either working towards the same goal or kind of more in an extractive infrastructural means. So the fumbling around the tech became a kind of node of relation, I guess, with people who maybe were not necessarily technologically oriented or tech people themselves, but were having to grapple with the obfuscations of whether an environmental data that was produced by certain kinds of institutions that were in disseminating environmental or air monitoring data, for example. I guess I was curious, like how people become fluent in different kinds of technical forms of knowledge based on the circumstances that produce it. And so like what kinds of subjects emerge from having to engage with an air monitoring sensor, for example, or an infrared camera or a geophone. Like all of these things become sort of like part of the becoming of a world in a sense, rather than something that is imminently tied to a learning process otherwise, like not necessarily a form of play but something that kind of constitutes a world of some kind. So the critique came as a part of like, well, what are the limitations of this sensor in trying to determine, the level of toxicity of air, for example? Who's responsible for putting the air monitors in certain places? What kind of data does that produce? How are certain people who have maybe been affected through illness, for example, learning to use different kinds of air monitoring technologies in order to be able to like make sense of what they're experiencing. And so, for me, I guess the technical forms sort of just change according to circumstance.
Interesting. So when you talked about the critique and sort of what the I think things like air sensors and infrared cameras are really interesting because they can detect some things but leave out others and open up worlds and close down other worlds. And you also mentioned the geophones. So when you were thinking about what those technologies can do, is that also when you started to get engaged with sort of like the histories of some of those technologies, like where with for example, like geophones coming from legacies of nuclear testing and military background and so on?
Yeah, I think the geophone is kind of a unique thing because in the sound art world, it's sort of more recently emerged as something that people are learning to play with and listen with across, different sorts of artistic practices. And I think I came to understand its place because there was a sound artist, Phil Peters, who was doing work on kind of trying to understand the fracking industry in the Permian Basin, where I was doing field work and using geophones to kind of understand the infrasonic frequencies that were being induced by fracking, but also being picked up by his own sort of network of geophones. And I was studying things like Thumper trucks, which is kind of how the technology eventually emerged into its form in industrial sense, where these Thumper trucks will essentially, they're like giant tanks that will induce earthquakes and kind of like sonar send seismic vibrations into the earth that will be reflected back as a kind of series of echoes to a network of geophones that are interconnected at the surface. And so these geophones will essentially detect infrasonic vibration, transduce that information, and produce spectrograms to give a kind of picture of the underground that will, tell geophysicists at the surface whether an area might have oil or that is suitable for fracking, or what kinds of other data it might produce. So there was a question there of like the use of this geophone as a kind of stethoscope or device for just listening to a kind of singular phenomena versus something that was being used for an industrial purpose. Adam Bobbitt actually has this great kind of genealogy of the geophone, and going back to its history in, I believe, the 18th century with volcanologist Frank Parrott, who was, as Adam Bobbitt writes, kind of invested in forms of volatile empiricism, so like living on the top of the volcano to listen with its eruptions, but also with the kind of vibrations at a threshold. And so he was kind of a forerunner in understanding what vibration is or how to detect vibration, what kinds of instruments might be necessary to listen with vibration. And Bobbitt goes into a great argument where suggesting that Parrott was really using his body as first and foremost an instrument of listening with these kinds of inaudibilities, or as a transducer of some kind that he would do things and experiment with that, like with writing seismic vibrations, so the kind of first seismographs of those machines that will draw the earthquake vibrations on a piece of paper.
They kind of look like a lie detector. You see it.
Okay. Yeah, so Parrott was kind of using his body to like draw these things or kind of notate the seismic waves, but also like biting his bedpost during more stronger vibrations or eruptions. So like really being able to like sense that sound is not necessarily just tympanic or through the ear, but also through other forms in flesh and bone as a conductor of those forms of energy as well.
Right.
So yeah, I became really interested in this genealogy, or like this kind of separable history of body and machine and techne, and the ways that sound artists were taking it up to play or come up with different kind of transformational possibilities of the technology, but then also how these are still part and parcel of a kind of military industrial complex of extractive history, and how that affects communities that are living in these areas that are affected by things like frackquakes. So yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that's fascinating, and that's actually a perfect segue because this show is all about sound and sustainability, kind of more broadly, and there's a lot of things I wanted to ask you about, but one in particular you mentioned a couple of minutes ago about the Permian Basin, and one of the projects I wanted to ask you about was titled Seismic Listening in the Permian Basin, and I'd love for you to tell me a little bit more about that project, and maybe to start, what does seismic listening to you? Like, I kind of have an intuitive sense of what that might mean, but I'm curious what was your intention with that term?
Yeah. So seismicity and sound are mechanical waves which require a medium to be able to be heard or to pass through. So in contrast to like an electromagnetic magnetic wave or radiation, they require a medium, so that essentially sound can pass through water, it passes through earth, it passes through air. It's modulated by these atmospheric forms. So that, as a geophysicist noted when I was asking him about the Thumper chuck, for example, that the matter or the difference between seismic and sound is a matter of philosophy. So as you can kind of emplace a body within these kind of atmospheric forms of energies that maybe exceed our abilities to sense and perceive them, I was very interested in how this mode of detecting frackquakes was not necessarily reducible to the technological forms that would produce a spectrogram, for example. They're not necessarily just measurable, but the ways that people were able, a frackquake, for example, it's not like on the Richter scale, something that's going to cause a lot of infrastructural damage at the surface. There's also other ways of measuring these, like the Mercalli intensity scale, which will measure like the magnitude of an earthquake based on kind of subtle phenomena that will happen, such as like dishes rattling on a shelf, or do trees wave in the outside, or that kind of thing. So these modes of detecting sensation are also bodily, right? So people were developing kind of ways of texting each other, or ways of kind of understanding the subtleties of these frackquakes with just questions like, did you feel it? And that kind of created its own zone of interference or understanding or listening that was kind of in excess of these technological forms of measurement. So I was kind of interested in how these little earthquakes would be informally understood, and then how that built kind of ephemeral senses of solidarity, or communities that were attuned to this kind of subtle phenomena happening, and connected to other ways that people were kind of thinking with infrastructural sound, such as infrasound produced by wind turbines, for example, that you may have heard of, or somewhat has been in the news a little bit about infrasonic illness and wind turbine syndrome. And so people complain a lot about feeling nauseous, or even having nightmares or suicidation from proximity to wind turbines. And there's a lot of kind of data that is politically charged, but also kind of scientifically ambiguous. And I was really interested in how people listen with the kind of like threshold frequencies of infrasound, and seismicity is kind of bound up with that as well. So I was kind of developing a concept around the felt zone, where maybe these kind of uncertainties of what one might be sensing or feeling can be sort of verified through networks of others who are sensing and feeling at the maybe at a distance or a proximity, but it's like what is the kind of empirical phenomena that is up for a question or debate or doubt or errancy within that, and how does that create a kind of extended sense of epistemic incoherence with these kind of scientific and institutional forms of knowing. So yeah, seismic listening, I think, is I think actually you brought this to a field recording workshop, but there was like a nice chart of the types of animals that will be able to detect infrasonic vibrations, or those that are at the other end of the spectrum that will be able to listen with ultrasound, such as bats or insects. So kind of the bigger animal you are, the more the longer the wave you will be able to detect, that kind of thing. So yeah, but I'm kind of interested in these sensory thresholds or thresholds of sensation that ultimately challenge what we consider to be known and knowable.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, it's we're never going to have time to get to all the questions that I want to ask. But one thing that was quite struck by when you were talking about that sort of the or what I interpreted was almost like kind of creating a network of bodies to either complement or contrast with the network of geophones that you'd mentioned earlier, which is sort of the and yeah, thinking about those are kind of different ways of knowing, which certainly in the scientific world, one network is much more privileged or true or valid than the other kind of network. So, but I was also very interested in what you're saying about the known, because I think I can see some interesting connections between that project that you just talked about and also the Fragile Frontiers project that plays with industrial listening. And one of the things that I was really interested in that was the idea of dowsing, which I remember, I think I read like there was like that US book series, The Great Brain, that was like set in Utah and like a Mormon kids school. And I think they did like dowsing there. And but then this term of fraudulent oil maps, which I found was fascinating, especially as we're talking about knowing and so on. So how do those fraudulent maps connect to listening, and this idea of industrial listening connected to seismic listening?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the 20th century, there was really a lot of land grabbing happening, as you can imagine, with an oil boom, and lands that had been previously territorialized or even demarcated, especially among Black and Indigenous communities in Oklahoma. They were being encouraged to sell those lands based on these fraudulent oil maps that would kind of demarcate or outline possible areas where oil was or wasn't, depending on what those lines were. So they were used as an instrument of dispossession, I think, first and foremost. With dowsing, this is more of a this has been really central to my research and thinking, kind of as a figure, like a central figure of what it means to kind of know beyond the senses and then trust an instrument to tell you what something is or not, but then have it be both a kind of source of mystical knowledge and also, the subject of a million different kind of scientific desires to debunk or prove or disprove, across the board. So, but interestingly, I was kind of interested in apprenticing with water commissioners in West Texas and trying to understand where oil companies themselves would commission water dowsers to find wells still. So there's like this kind of history of wildcatting. So, right, the prospecting that comes with making something like a fraudulent map, but also devising means of understanding the underground and all of its speculative properties to decide whether there's oil there or not. And dowsing is one of these technologies that would enable such prospecting efforts to commingle with like something like a geophone.
Sorry to interrupt, but maybe just maybe you could kind of tell people what dowsing is for people that may not be familiar with that.
Sorry. You were already talking about this book, and I got lost in it. So,
I kind of learned about it as a kid. So, but yeah, there may be people that may not be familiar with it.
Yeah. So, right, of course, that would be Don't bury the lead. The dowsing is essentially a practice of waving. In the 15th century, this was part of a practice of metallurgy. So trying to understand where mineral ores could be found or water under the ground, using witch hazel sticks, particularly, which then kind of evolved in the 20th century with oil prospecting efforts and wildcatting to use copper rods or like a Y-shaped stick. There are other methods of using pendulums. And so part of these prospecting efforts might have dangled pendulums over a map to be able to understand the topography of that area. So so a lot of dowsing will kind of invoke some kind of specious energy that is in excess of a bodily form of knowing, and to understand where these kind of sources of underground water or mineral ores or even lost items. People will use coat hangers as well. It's often described among various people that some people are able to just have the touch or have this kind of electricity in their bodies that enables them to sense ores under the ground, and some do not. And so this kind of, bodies are different and they're not biologically self-same. The kind of medium of energy or whatever is for some and not for all. And the kind of, if you have the dowsing gift, that's how people talk about it. So, and I kind of lost where I was in my thoughts. So remind me.
That's okay, because I think, there's a million different directions there, but.
The Fragile Frontiers thing. Yeah. So I was just like kind of interested in what dowsing is also in a part of a large. There's a large network of American dowsing, particularly, but it's kind of connected to communities of healing and spirituality and other forms of kind of dealing with energy. And dowsing itself is like a way of kind of remediating a lot of these more extractive practices and such. So I was interested in like what, if I'm playing with the technology against itself, against its use form, how to use something like dowsing over a fraudulent map in a sense that would enable a sense of remediation rather than extraction. So it's not to find oil, but to maybe deter the wildcatters or something. But no magical intent so much as just interested in a kind of practice of doing so with thinking with the sound as pointing to that concept.
Okay. So that's so I love that phrase, thinking with the sound, and that's actually a good connection to, well, yeah, the segue makes sense in my mind. We'll see if it does in yours. But switching gears a little bit, so one of the things I'm curious about your work is kind of the relationship with different forms of artistic expression or even venues. So you've worked with installation, scores, paper making, participatory listening, and other forms. And I'm curious your thoughts, and I'm curious, like I often ask different multidisciplinary artists about this, around what parts of kind of your approach and process stay the same or maybe kind of consistent across those different forms. And in one sense, the form doesn't matter. It's all the same work, just manifesting in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe at the same time, what different formats or venues might actually let you explore. Like, for example, what you can do in a gallery installation that's going to sit there for a month is very different than what might be a poetry reading or a paper sculpture, or maybe it's not. I'm kind of curious about that. So, like for example, one of your works was Fluxus and listening scores, performing nothing happening between students of atmosphere and museum going.
Mm-hmm.
So, just from the title of that, it sounds like the museum and the space was actually part of like the artistic concept, as opposed to something that would just be released as a field recording or something like that. So yeah, I'm curious kind of your general thoughts on this relationship of your work and your practice to different mediums and venues.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really interesting question. I'm not totally sure how to answer it, except I think, you know, because I think I'm ultimately interested in ephemerality as like what maybe organizes my work or interest. But I think I approach things conceptually. So like a history of conceptual art is like really about the form being kind of arbitrary, or that the concept matters more, and that it's not necessarily about the performance of the thing, but the process. And I think this, coming to anthropology with a background in art, or as an artist, I guess, was sort of like, how do I enter a field of concepts where my practice has really been about previously like working with materials, or language as material, or sound as material, and what does it mean to kind of like think with a concept first, and then the materials are sort of in service to that. So the Fluxus score thing, I mean, this came out of a class that I was teaching that was invested in kind of pedagogies of practice, and how material forms, and like how to essentially approach concepts with materials, how to think with materials, particularly environmental concepts. And the performance was part of a exhibition that Sora King had curated called Notations on Ritual, which was at the Carnegie in Cincinnati. And so various artists kind of had either objects or practice that reflected interest in ritual as the kind of thematic thing. So we were how do we approach that? I guess as a group, as an ephemeral performance, and I devised a kind of textual and listening scores workshop where students, kind of following a history of listening and textual scores and Fluxus from the 1960s onward, were devised ordinary activities for us to do or not. The history of the score, a textual score anyway, is that it's kind of a literary thing that doesn't necessarily have to be performed. It's a way of thinking about how you might listen or how you might perform, or these kind of speculations on performance. And so all of the students wrote scores for each other. We all put them into a big jar and had some props with the option of, kind of refusing the score if you didn't want to like perform the score. And the idea was kind of to blur the line between performer and museum goer to draw attention to the fact that like performative practices are things that that's how culture organizes itself. This is not necessarily a human activity. It's not necessarily a conscious activity. It's social practices and forms emerge through relationships to ritual and and performance itself. So the nothing happening is kind of to enable a critical kind of apparatus around, well, what is performance anyway? And it was really fun. The venue itself was like it was really beautiful gallery. I think a former library, or I don't know. It had a big cupola, and so we were able to do things like, or not, fish from the second story or something, or like cloud watch, or performing these kinds of ordinary activities, or blow dry your hair, or invite museum goers to like tell ghost stories to each other, and and kind of to make the verb of performance kind of indistinct with observation, and to help students, I guess, and myself and anyone, I guess, who was there think about what it means to be part of this process of performance for each other. So does that answer your question? I kind of forgot what it was.
No, it totally does, and it's an interesting kind of flow, because it's been really interesting sort of hearing you talk and sort of picking up on some of these themes and threads. And one of the I wanted to sort of pursue was this idea of ephemerality, which I really enjoy, certainly as a live performer, where even if I wanted to, I could never recreate any of my performances because of all which I like maybe 5-10 years ago I was really frustrated by, but I've completely come to embrace, and I just love that. But I'm interested also in the connection of your work. You're also interested in the concepts of fluidity and immaterialisms. And for the listeners, this is kind of written as IM/materialism. So immaterial and materialism are kind of put together. And I was struck by the contrasts, or at least kind of relationships between a couple of your projects from 2024. One, Sounding Lines, A Vague Machine of No, you describe as experiments in measurement, line, in the equations of fluid dynamics with a sound fiber installation. And then also in the same year, a different project called Interference Patterns that was, and I'm quoting here, following the concept of line, drawing and being drawn, ham radio transmissions, minor ethnographies of encounter and connection. And I found that very interesting, because I guess what the way my brain works, when I sort of see, like literally see measurement in lines, I can see that. I can imagine an Excel spreadsheet, I can imagine a graph and so on, compared to radio transmissions that are visible and ephemeral until you have this little box with a dial on it that you can tune, and then all of a sudden there's like Miley Cyrus blasting into the speakers, or static, or kind of whatever. So initially I thought about those as contrasting projects, but the more I thought about your concepts of fluidity and immaterialisms, maybe those aren't really contrasting at all. They're sort of different interpretation of those. Like, did I get that right? Or like, are those concepts kind of flowing through and across these different works?
Yeah, I'm really glad you point that out, because I don't know that I really saw that in the same way. I think, well, mostly because these projects felt very distinct to me. The Sounding Lines was, so a lot of these times I'm like referencing the ways that other artists have also worked with similar kinds of concepts. So the Sounding Lines are, in the history of, I guess, measurements used to measure fathoms of the ocean. So they would drop off these weights off of the side
sounding in terms of like sound. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, that didn't even occur to me. Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So it's a sort of play on words. That's the
Okay.
poetry part of it.
Right.
Yeah, so to sound depths, and I was, kind of referencing all of this work that I had been doing around seismicity and frac quakes and listening and making reference to people who, like photographer Etienne Jules Mari, who was using smoke and photography to kind of understand turbulent flows in and line in ephemeral matter. So like smoke and yeah, what does it do to think with these kinds of equations of fluid dynamics, which are responsible for the kind of making of hydraulic fracking infrastructure and extraction, and also describe things like the processes of breathing and the formation of clouds, and the way that water beads up on a humidifier, and the viscosities of oil, and all of these things are sort of like encompassed within this set of equations, which can be historicized and situated and made kind of geographically incommensurate with the different kinds of forms of matter at hand, but kind of propose a neutrality across these disparate forms and histories. So I wanted to kind of think with that, making, I was just using objects kind of at hand, a lot of debris and kind of rusted objects that I had collected off of the side of railroads and at oil refinery sites, and a lot of kind of other kinds of ephemera that people had forgotten about, lottery tickets and receipts and beer cans and that kind of thing. And I wondered, like, what does it mean to kind of collect these things within a context of an energy sacrifice zone, things that have been discarded and forgotten into a form of measurement with that doesn't, like, what is the measure of a life, I guess, in that sense. How do you measure an ordinary life that has been kind of organized through fracking as an industry, but doesn't necessarily contain what is in excess of that. Interference patterns, I think, was more out of, I was working with these amateur ham radio operators, and kind of trying to understand what the use of pirate frequencies might do to enable, yeah, that it was sort of also just like learning how they think about connection, and given that a lot of these things can be held together in a global sense, but then it's really just about like saying hi and your call number and like carrying antennas out into the middle of nowhere or whatever to a set of coordinates, and then like seeing what you can ping, and yeah, so I was kind of interested in what is a line in that sense? How does a line connect something? The Deleuzian sense of a line of flight, or ligne de fuite, if you translate that into French, is actually more, I think there's an idiomatic expression of it's like a vanishing line, like the way that water swirls through a drain, rather than, as we've come to understand it, maybe in a translated sense of, and metaphorically, as some like kind of the way that a concept takes flight, or the way that a metaphor will enable a form of thinking, or what kind of ideas spin off from a set of variables, or assemblage of variables. And I was thinking about like how should we had understood, like if we had understood those things in a context of fluid dynamics, or in a context of like hydraulic physics, like how would that alter our sense of what a line is or can be, and would that have a determinate and fixed point of entry and end, or would that enable us to think of things with more in a more ephemeral sense, in a more kind of uncontained or unknowable sense. How do you measure a process of breathing? I don't know.
Right.
So yeah, with interference patterns, that was kind of a descriptive effort of trying to organize understandings of what a culture of connection or frequency might look like in an atmosphere that is constantly being governed by a sense of law. I guess atmosphere as a space of law and jurisdiction. So.
That's yeah, it's amazing hearing the concepts behind that, and it actually, unfortunately, just sort of looking at the time, so I want to make sure I fit in this question, which I think is especially interesting for me, given what you were saying a few minutes ago about starting with the concept first. So, one of the things I'm always curious about, and I usually ask everyone I interview, is this kind of relationship between the artist and the artistic intent and the audience. And talking to many artists, and either on my show or just artists that I know, I've really seen a whole spectrum of those approaches, where for some artists and some artistic works, especially in the environmental sustainability space, it's very, very obvious what the message is. And sometimes so obvious that it actually feels like a public service, like, listen to this, you should be sustainable. It's like, okay, it's almost like a marketing message. And at the other end of the spectrum, things are kind of so abstract and so esoteric that the audience has no idea what's going on. They have no idea it's connected to sustainability at all. And usually it's not completely at either end of the spectrum. It's a bit of a sort of a range there. But I'm curious, like, where would you kind of place sort of your work on that spectrum, or maybe a different way of putting it, of how important is it to you that the audience understands that concept that you started with, or the intent, or your message, or your vision, or whatever it is that's kind of driving that piece.
Yeah, I really like this question. I think it opens a different kind of set of angles for me than maybe what you want me to say or want me to,
I'm
when I
happy
start
with whatever
thinking
you
about
want to
it.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, no, well, I think it's like I'm really interested in illegibility, because these things are sort of socially constructed, and uh, what I struggle with this a lot because no one can really be a poet anymore. It's like the kind of material conditions of what, or maybe they could never be a poet. I don't know, but like that figure of oneself or whatever as like a poet in the world or an artist in the world, like you are constantly constrained by the fact of having to live or having to make a living. And I think a lot of these forms of artistic research or of trying to professionalize as an artist as a means of making your work legible, as a means of making it stable, of creating stable objects that can be commodified and circulated and made to represent some kind of body of work or you as an artist or something, prevents a lot of people from being able to access art as just an everyday activity that we do as a performance of everyday life, as a kind of like process of making and making sense of the world. And yeah, at the same time, like I think a lot of my writing references, histories of abstract art and practices of abstraction and poetry that leans a bit more so-called experimental, practices that are ephemeral and not necessarily easy to grasp or hold on to. I struggle to articulate, and that becomes a kind of force of my theory, as well as what shows up and how things come to form or not. A lot of these projects that I do don't really have a beginning or an end. They're just sort of iterative things that are happening as the process of thinking is going on. And so I think this might be on my website, but when I was doing a lot of work with wind in the Permian Basin and wind energy, and kind of thinking about the ways that people were thinking about renewable energy or not. I created a lot of ways of listening with, or created a lot of forms for wind, which ended up being like 50 something different kinds of ways of approaching wind, with kind of failed field recordings or ways of making iterative cyanotypes or different kinds of fabric and textile making to like think about aleatory or chance sound as the wind makes it. The Sounding Lines project is objects being moved by or moved through with the wind, and it becomes hard to write about and hard to characterize and hard to describe, because it isn't like something that I can say I started with this intent and then I ended up here and this is the result of that and here's what I have to offer to the kind of discourse of whatever it is. It's more of a like, how can we think about concepts, and how can we think about material practice, and how can we think about ethnography in ways that are iterative, and in a word that I like a lot that people are using more now is minor. We're thinking about the minor and in terms of these relationships to the emancipatory promises of theory. Probably the minor kind of steps into lurk or lag behind these forms of worlding, or like these things that we would like to classify and contain. So if I'm always kind of working with the resisting those, even a word like sustainability, can be peeled through and questioned and taken apart and seen at different angles at different times of day and different kinds of media, and I guess I'm kind of more interested in the peeling apart of objects than I am in producing things for consumption. And yeah, and I know that a lot of artists feel this way and are constrained by resources and time and pressure and institutional efforts to make things legible and make things consumable and make things circulable. And yeah, I think, even being in an academic setting enables me to it creates more parameters around certain types of thinking, and then it enables you to sort of give yourself the illusion that you have time to do thinking. I don't know, you probably feel this way as well, but I feel like more academics are more administrators of thought than they are thinkers these days anyway. But yeah, I'm thinking a lot about constraint and not only ethnographic constraint or conceptual constraint around making, but the constraints of efforts to live, the constraints around and pressures to think about a future that is already foreclosed and overwritten in some cases and overdetermined through someone else's idea of what a future is and how to control that. So I'm yeah, kind of intimately wanting to kind of protect the shadows of what that is to prevent emergence as something that can be visible and captured all the time. So
Well, yeah, that's fascinating. It's yeah, I wish we had more time to dive into that, but one of the constraints we're working with is the the time limit of our radio show. So yeah, thanks for all those amazing thoughts, and yeah, maybe we'll have to have you back again to sort of get into. I have like another 5 questions that I wanted to ask that we didn't have time to get to, so maybe we can do a part 2 at some point. But before we wrap up, as usual, to close the show, we share some recordings with our listeners, and you've generously shared some works from the Fragile Frontiers project. And you talked about that a little bit earlier in the conversation, talking about the concept itself. But can you kind of set this up for you? Like, what are we actually going to hear when we hear it?
Yeah, so these sounds were made with a bunch of contact mics and a bunch of household items and weaving tools. And they're using kind of dowsing techniques, so kind of following John Cage and like aleatory sound or like chance sound and things like wind chimes or aeolian harps.
Right.
Are kind of these instruments that enable a different force to pass through rather than something that you're making with your breath or with your hands. And so you're listening essentially with a kind of chance movement or ideomotor effect, as they say in the dowsing world. That and I guess I'll just kind of leave it there. You can speculate as to what kinds of objects they might be, and
Right.
yeah, the contact mic itself are not going to be necessarily representational of the things that are touching it, but yeah, to think with as Marina Peterson writes about, sound is touch, and I wanted to think with contact mics in this sense. So.
Okay, excellent. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing those sounds. Yeah, we're really happy to share that with people. And yeah, well, thanks everyone for listening. Make sure to check out the show notes for more background on Megan's sound, links to some of the projects that we talked about, and the music and the sounds we talked about as well. Let me know if you have any ideas for artists we should be highlighting that I can talk to another time. And thanks again for your time, Megan. I really enjoyed that conversation. It's I just wish we didn't have that time constraint to be forced to
That would
wrap
be
up.
great to do a part 2, and I can also interview you.
Yeah, for sure. That'd be fun, actually. Yeah. Part 2. All right. All right. Thanks, Megan. Thanks so much for your time.
Bye.
Okay, thanks for listening to Sustain. Hope to catch you again next time. Be sure to sign up for our email list on our website, sustain.fm. Follow our Instagram, also sustain.fm. You get more info on the radio show, in-person events in different cities, live streams, and more. All right, until next time, see you on the dance floor.